Hello everyone, I'm Oscar, a product designer at Figma, working on the editor. I'm based in Sweden and I'm really excited to be with you here at Config.
Hi everyone, I'm Joel. I'm a product designer working at Figma too, and I'm based in London. And in case you just missed it, we just launched a brand new version of Auto Layout, and we're really excited to talk about the design process today. But before we dive into that, let's just cast our minds back to previous versions of Auto Layout and take a look at some of the community's opinions.
Auto Layout is awesome. It's one of the smoothest and sweetest features on Figma. Stress-free stuff.
Auto Layout in Figma is stressing me out.
Auto Layout uses some flexbox behavior, which is just fire.
What causes more headaches, Flexbox or Auto Layout?
And designers say they hate Auto Layout, but we all secretly love it.
I hate Auto Layout. I hate Auto Layout. I hate Auto Layout. Oh, now it works. I love Auto Layout.
All right, so about a year ago, when we started thinking of this project, we saw this theme that you might have noticed in some of these tweets. There were two types of emotions or two types of opinions out there about Auto Layout. So we started digging into research. And here's Raji from our designer advocate team reaching out on Twitter. We also did user interviews. We did user testing of the existing version of Auto Layout. We read the forums. And all evidence pointed basically in the same direction, that users fall into two different groups. The first group was the believers, the fans of Auto Layout that use it for most of their work and really love it and know it in and out. But then we have the designers who are a bit more sort of skeptical towards it and perhaps struggling to learn it, not using it that much, and generally not being very excited about Auto Layout. And obviously there was more nuance to our findings, but this was a really clear pattern that we saw. And we also saw some tension between these groups because sometimes you can have two designers on the same team being in each of these camps, right? One designer being more skeptic, one designer being more a believer. And this can make it really hard to collaborate, right? Because in Figma, you're working in the same file a lot of the time. And if one designer is using Auto Layout, one designer not using it, it can become really tricky because it's kind of a fundamental part of your workflow, right? How you're layouting your designs. And with the help from our data science team, we could see the scope of this problem or how big these groups were. And what we found was about 80% of Figma users fall into the skeptics category. And this really surprised us. This felt like a really big number. At the same time, Figma's mission as a company is to make design accessible to everyone. And here we have a core feature of the product where like 80% of users are struggling to use it. So when we started scoping out this project, we really thought about it this way, that we have these two groups or these two emotions, and we need to design for the space between our skeptics and our believers. And perhaps more worryingly, we also need to design for two different design goals that sometimes are in conflict with each other. So both designing for ease of use and designing for more feature and more power of Auto Layout, because that's what the believers are asking for, right? As we designed this, all the improvements and features in Auto Layout, we sort of always came back to three design principles that helped us design for both of these goals. And that's what we're going to focus this talk on. So the first one is visualize the system status. The second one is fluid and flexible interactions. And the third one is more powerful layouts, asterisks. And Joel is going to take us to the first principle here.
So our first design principle is actually inspired by one of the Nilsson usability heuristics for interaction design, which is visualize the system status. So let's just take a look at a few examples of what this means. Well, from our Auto Layout research on Auto Layout 3, we found that many designers just didn't understand exactly how these layouts were created or constructed, or even how the layers were organized. In fact, we frequently witnessed so many designers removing auto layout completely just to make a simple edit, because it was just a lot easier for them to understand it that way. Now imagine doing this for every single layout and every single edit. It's just so painful and it takes up so much time. So we knew we needed to make improvements so that it was clear to edit and understand layers and layouts. So let's start with the elephant in the room, layers in auto layout. So in auto layout, the layer ordering is reversed when compared to the rest of the layer tree. And I'm not going to explain all the reasons why. Show's already done this already on Twitter, so check that out if you're interested. But in summary, it was really confusing to a lot of people, and it just added a bunch of unnecessary load onto the mental model. So today, we've changed this so that the layer ordering now maps one-to-one with the canvas. And it makes it much easier for folks to understand more complex layouts that have a lot of nested frames. Okay, now let's pan over to the canvas. So previously, when you were clicking on frames on the canvas, it was really difficult to know if it had auto layout applied to it without looking at the layer icon in the layer tree or the properties panel. So to help visualize the system status on the canvas, we took some inspiration from something called Chrome DevTools. Now, for those that don't know, Google Chrome DevTools is a set of web developer tools that's built directly into the Google Chrome browser. And it helps developers to edit pages and diagnose problems really quickly. One of my favorite things about DevTools is that it visually displays things like margins and paddings directly on the web page. So it's super clear to understand and inspect and see what elements you're editing. So we wanted to bring some of these ideas to the canvas and to auto layout. So now, when you hover on a frame, you'll be able to see a canvas visualization of the frame structure and the children layers within that. And you'll also be able to see where padding and spacing has been applied with some new visualizations. So these two things alone really help you to differentiate a typical frame from an auto layout frame. So that's the layer panel, and that's the canvas. Now let's look at the properties panel. In the last version of auto layout, we introduced so much more power, which was awesome. So there were resize modes, there were more padding controls, there was a new alignment control, and it really allowed designers to create much more flexible layouts than before. But with more power comes more complexity, and we heard that a lot of designers just didn't quite understand the new UI. The alignment controls were a bit too hidden behind panels, and it made it really difficult to understand a layout really quickly. And it was also really common for padding to have different values for left and right and top and bottom. So this actually meant that the padding input showed mixed a bunch of the time. And overall, the UI was just a bit cumbersome and a bit hard to navigate. It involved a lot of clicks and a lot of indirect manipulation. And one thing that we found during user testing was that some designers just didn't understand the resizing control whatsoever. So they were mistaking one resize mode for the other, and they didn't quite understand what each property did. And sometimes they didn't even notice when the widget changed. So with this new version of auto layout, we really wanted to address all these problems and all these issues. So we started by exploring different ways to improve the controls in the properties panel. And after a bunch of iterations and many Figma pages later, we landed on a new UI. So we decided to separate padding, alignment, and surface everything in the properties panel in line. So now the alignment control is a lot easier to use and it's a lot quicker. And the padding has moved from a single control to be paired controls for top and bottom and left and right, with an option for individual padding too. So now this is a lot quicker to use, and it also removes those mixed states that you were seeing in Auto Layout 3. But we didn't stop there. So you'll notice that when you hover on the padding and spacing inputs, the same padding and spacing is also highlighted on the canvas. And that's because we really wanted to tie these two things together so that you can start to make the connection between the properties panel and the canvas. So for resize modes, we just decided to remove the widget altogether because we only found that a small fraction of designers found it helpful. And we moved the drop-down controls to be underneath the height and the width inputs. So by moving these controls, it sort of helps you to understand the relationship between the dimensions or the size of a frame and the way that it resizes. And to add to this, we also added some canvas visualizations to help indicate what contents is in her contents and what container is in fill container. So that's a few examples of how we visualize the system status. let me just pass it back to Oscar to talk about our next design principle.
So our second design principle was to embrace fluid and flexible interaction whenever possible. Because one piece of feedback that kept coming up from Layout 3 was that it really felt so sort of structured and rigid and sort of hard to manipulate, almost like your design is like stuck in glue or something on the canvas. But we wanted it to be more sort of in the putting you in the flow basically, and enabling more use cases, and not feeling like you just have to use it for this just final step to sort of polish up your design or kind of add more structure. So we wanted it to be more generally useful and generally like a great tool. And to do this, we looked at how can we add more direct manipulation, like it's a core thing we know in Figma, right? Editing things on the canvas, it's live, it's multiplayer. And we also looked at how can we add more sort of contextual actions that sort of keep you on the canvas, sort of focused on the sort of the layouting that you're doing when you're selecting and perhaps moving objects around and changing your layout. Perhaps a bit like FigJam here with the toolbar. And one early exploration here that we're looking at is us actually trying to do just that, like putting a toolbar with the sort of layouting options right on the canvas where you're sort of like editing your layout. And this was really interesting, and we went kind of deep on this. Also incorporating direct manipulation options, like perhaps dragging for alignment or dragging for padding and spacing, and having all the options right on the canvas for your layouts. Yeah, as I said, we went really deep on this, like prototyped it in depth. This is a Figma prototype actually that we ran user testing on. We also built this out internally on our internal version of Figma. And it was really interesting. It was, in many ways, it was really powerful to have your layouting options right there, like when you're on the canvas. And it really helped communicate what you were editing, and people were actually getting auto layout from this, and it was really interesting. But at the same time, it added some complexity, and we saw that it didn't really work in all cases, because now we had options on the canvas and perhaps options in the design panel, and it also took up a lot of space and kind of felt cumbersome as well. So we actually walked back on this design. And what we ended up with was sort of taking the best parts of this forward, kind of in the spirit of fluid and flexible interactions. So what you can do in Layout 4 is that not only can you use drag handles to sort of directly manipulate and sort of find the right value for your design for things like padding and spacing, but you can also click on the padding and spacing areas to open an input field to enter exact numbers. And we found this just super powerful, and the fact that this happens on the canvas, that the input field is on the canvas, really sort of keeps you in the flow. Adding to this, we also added keyboard modifiers so that you could do like drag and do like pairwise editing or four-way padding editing. You can also click to open the input and then enter CSS syntax. You can use the arrow keys to nudge. You can drag with nudge values actually with another keyboard shortcut. And there's just so many ways to edit with Layout 4 right on the canvas. And yeah, this is what we're talking about with fluid and flexible interactions, right? And we hope this supports more workflows. Another example of this is hug and fill. So we got feedback that this is just really cumbersome to work with because it's a really common interaction. And you just have to keep going to the properties panel and changing hug and fill when it comes to the resize behaviors. And what we did there was adding sort of a shortcut to do this by double clicking on edges of your node that you're selected. And it keeps you in the flow. It keeps it sort of feeling direct manipulation-y and right there on the canvas. So also along the line of keeping interactions really fluid, really flexible, and keep you in the flow. All right, next principle, Joel.
So our final design principle was to enable more powerful layouts. Now, with auto layout, there's always a lot of feature requests for the next version, and this was no different. So there were things like wrapping, min-max values, grids, negative spacing, z-index, breakpoints. The list was endless. And all of these features would have made auto layout 4 super powerful. But we need to remember who we are building auto layout for. So while the believers would have loved more power and more features, we still had a bunch of skeptics that weren't using auto layout at all. So adding more power with added complexity would have just made things a lot worse for those people. So if we're going to add more powerful layouts, we need to do it in a way that doesn't add complexity and it doesn't hurt usability. Okay, so auto layout 3, it enabled a lot more flexible layouts, but a lot of common components, things like tooltips, avatar groups, or buttons with badges, they just couldn't be built. And actually, a lot of power users were hacking auto layout so that they could build these components. And in fact, there was a config talk last year about this called pushing Figma to its limits. So in one example, Gleb talks about a method to achieve absolute positioning. So for those that don't know, absolute positioning is a CSS property, and it basically allows elements to ignore the normal flow of layout. So why would you want to do this? Well, let's say you're building a tooltip component, and you actually want to use auto layout so that the container resizes automatically depending on the text size. And you also want to be able to control the padding easily. Well, that's fine, but there's one issue. How do you put the point of the tooltip inside of the auto layout frame? Well, Gleb explains that you can use something called a zero frame. So this is a frame with 0 pixels on one axis or both axes, and it has clip content disabled. And it's basically used as a way to place things like the tooltip point outside of the flow of the auto layout frame. So that's great. It works for the designer building it, but actually it creates a really bad experience for anyone trying to collaborate on it. I mean, first of all, there's a frame with 0 height inside of the component. So if you're a developer inspecting this thing, it's super confusing because it just looks like a bug, and it starts to make you lose trust with the rest of the design. And if you're a designer wanting to edit this component, it's pretty confusing to understand what's going on unless you know about the 0 frame hack in the first place. So with this version of auto layout, we wanted to make it so that you don't have to hack it in order to create a simple component like a tooltip. So we've explored a bunch of different ways that we could do this and how absolute positioning could be applied in Figma. So the first example on the left is this idea of a positioning section. We thought maybe we can move the X and Y inputs closer to constraints and tie these things together because they're all related to positioning. But it didn't feel quite right moving X and Y out of the transform section. So then we thought, well, maybe we can move the constraints to be closer to X and Y and have it in some sort of like pop-out window. But then that didn't feel quite right either because you were sort of moving constraints from one place if it didn't have auto layout and then moving it to another place if it did have auto layout. So it felt a bit weird. But one solution that did feel good was this idea of having a control that enabled the X and Y inputs. Because in a way, you're sort of enabling free positioning or manual positioning within auto layout. So here you'll notice that there's like a question mark next to the control. Well, one interesting part about this feature was actually trying to figure out what the right icon to use is to represent absolute positioning. And Oscar and I had like so many different Figma pages exploring this. And here are just a few different iterations of that. Okay, so today, if you want to build a tooltip component, you don't need these 0 frames. You can simply place the point inside the auto layout frame and toggle on the absolute positioning control. Super simple. And then once that's enabled, you can actually position it freely like any other layer. So that's great. And then if you look in the layer tree, you can actually visually see which layers are using absolute positioning because the layer icon has a new visual treatment to help visualize its status. So now any designers using the component will be able to easily understand how it's designed, and any developers inspecting the component won't be confused because it will be designed so much closer to how it's built in code. So those are our 3 design principles behind auto layout. Let me just pass it back to Oscar for some parting thoughts.
All right. Yeah, so just a few more words to wrap this up. First off, we really hope you like these new features and improvements. Please send your feedback. We're always listening. Also really want to big thanks to our engineering team here with Brian, Katie, and Michael. They've been really doing an amazing work, sweating the details on many of these interactions, and we're really excited about that. All right, so we hope this talk has been giving you some insight into designing for this space between, and ultimately that we also might help build some bridges here. between our skeptics and our believers, between designing for exploration with auto layout and designing for specification with auto layout. And also perhaps between designers and developers, with auto layout making you sort of speak the same language as your developer with some of these layouting tools. That's it for us. I'm Oscar. You can find me on Twitter at OSCRSE.
And I'm Joel. Thank you so much. Feel free to reach out to me on Twitter as well, at Joel Talks Design. I'd really love to hear your feedback and reactions.